journey to lost civilizations. See ancient artifacts and long-lost ancient scrolls.
The strange writing on this clay brick is known as cuneiform. Now, the script was used for
Take the journey of a lifetime and travel to ancient Babylon and the island of Patmos to discover how ancient mysteries reveal the future. A live seminar series. Don't miss any program.
Back in 1927, over there in Cape Cod, just on the Cape Cod Bay, just there near Boston, Massachusetts, the story is told that there was a US submarine ship, and it basically collided with a Coast Guard ship. And so the submarine actually sank, and for some reason or other, it wasn't able to come back. And so 6 of these submariners were trapped inside this submarine. Has anyone heard this story before? It actually is a true story. You can look it up. I'm not making this up. So 6 of them were trapped in the submarine, and while they were in there, they were getting low on their oxygen tank fuels, and so they were, imagine, their lives were on the line. They didn't know if they were going to survive the night. And so as the rescue people started to come and look for them, they could hear, as they got closer to the submarine, that they could hear somewhat of a tapping noise. And what they understood, that someone was giving a Morse code message from inside the submarine. And so as someone who understood Morse code listened to the tapping of the noise, and the message that was coming through from inside the submarine was, "Is there any hope?" Isn't that a good question? I mean, they were basically, their lives were on the line, and they're asking the question, is there any hope? And you know, if I could just use this illustration to jump into tonight's presentation, in some ways, the culture in which we live in is asking the very same question. Do you agree with what I'm saying? I don't know about you, but the life that I'm living in 2017 is drastically different from the life I lived when I was growing up as a little kid in Sydney, in Australia. So people are asking the question, is there any hope? And I want to submit to you this evening, we're going to be looking at history, going to be looking at archaeology, we're going to be looking at a bunch of stuff, but primarily these lectures are meant to inspire hope and confidence, and you'll see why in just a moment. I don't know about you, but every time I turn on my TV or go on social media, we see that there is some form of terrorist activity happening in the world. Do you agree with what I'm saying? It just, I mean, some of you will even remember where you were and what you were doing when September 11 happened. Yeah. You know exactly what had happened, where you were, the environment. I remember I was in Sydney. Woke up in the morning, just having breakfast, turn on the TV, and I'm turning channel 9, and it flicked channel 10, it was all the same. It was a day that literally changed the world. Some of you may have remembered just a few months ago, in March 22, 2017, the Westminster attack. Hands up if you saw that on the news. 50-year-old Briton drove a car into pedestrians on the pavement along the south side of Westminster Bridge and Bridge Street, injuring more than 50 people, and unfortunately 4 people were fatally wounded. And by the way, I could have shared a dozen or so stories of what's happening in terms of terrorism in the world. And so this is a reality that we're living in. Do you agree with what I'm saying? We live in a world where anything can literally happen at any moment in time. Some of you realize the Ukraine crisis that happened over there in Europe. Some of you who are more, passionate about environmentalism and what's going on in the environment around us, the idea of climate change and its effects is somewhat on the current world agenda. We also see the fragile global economy just a few years ago, the world financial crisis back in 2008. And so I'm just sharing some of these things as we're leading to our topic tonight, that we're living in somewhat uncertain times. Do you agree with what I'm saying? We cannot assume life is just going to continue just as it has in the past. So the question I want to pose to you, my friends, tonight is, what does the future hold? Now, I don't know about you, but if you've looked into the idea of prophecy, predictions, if you do a Google search on prophecy, Do you know how many hits that will come up if you simply type in the word prophecy? And just yell out a few guesses. A million. More than that. Quiet audience tonight. 10 million. Actually, if you type in prophecy, you will have over 54 million hits. And so there is seemingly an awareness and an interest, if I could say, in prophecy. And we're going to look a little bit into that tonight. So what does the future hold? You know, some people like to turn to psychics. They like to turn to people who are able to read the future or read their palms and somewhat give them a picture of what their future could be like. I remember my mother, you know, growing up in Sydney, she used to love the horoscopes. You know, she would just go right to that section in the paper and she'd read her lucky star sign and what would happen that day and you know, and she was all into that. And you know, there's plenty of people who turn to psychics to somehow find meaning and future direction for their future. So what does the future hold? Some of you remember, Paul gave it away, some of you remember back in 2012, based on somewhat on the research of Nostradamus, there was a big cahoots over the world ending in 2012. Hands up if you remember that. Just a few years ago, they made a movie about it, and there was all this buzz around 2012, and the idea is that they took a little bit of what Nostradamus said and a bit of the ancient Aztec Empire, and they basically said that the world would end in 2012. My friends, what happened? Absolutely nothing. Now, let me just pause here. I'm not saying this to ridicule people who had this idea. I'm simply making the point that it's very hard to predict the future. Okay? So nothing happened. Some of you who are a little bit older like I am, remember back in 1999 when it was on the verge of 2000, the famous Y2K bug, remember that? And everyone was saying, guess what? In January 1, 2000, all the computers are going to crash and it's going to be an economic meltdown and basically there's going to be catastrophe in the world. Do you remember that? Am I the only one that's old enough to remember this? I'm sure I can see some of you that can remember this too. There was a big buzz about Y2K bug and all of this. Make sure that your electronic device, the computers were going to blow up, and there was all this anxiety over 2000. But friends, what actually happened? Nothing. And again, I just want to pause and say that those who had these thoughts and ideas, we're not knocking them in any way, we're simply making the point that it is very hard to predict the future. And very well-meaning people over time, not just in our time, but all through the centuries, have tried to make concrete predictions, and some of them have not come to pass. It simply tells us as a human race, it's very hard to predict the future. I don't know if you know this magazine, if it's in New Zealand, but there's a magazine called These Times. And what they ran an article recently, and they kind of looked at all the psychics and those who claim to be able to know and predict the future. What they discovered in the article is that 6 out of 250 predictions were actually correct. Now you think about that for a moment. Out of 250 predictions, they only got how many right? 6 correct, which is basically, well, only 3%. In fact, the average leading psychic accuracy, batting average, if I put it that way, is around the ballpark of 16%. Now, if you're a psychic here this evening, I'm not knocking your profession. What I am trying to say tonight is this. It is very hard to predict the future. So, which leads me to my next transition in tonight's presentation is, if psychics seem not to be able to get it right all the time. 2012, people are saying the end of the world happened, it didn't happen. The year 2000, there was this hysteria about Y2K bug and nothing happened. It brings us to a deeper question. The question tonight is this: can we actually know the future? That's a big question. That's a huge dimension of conversation around it. Can we actually know the future? Well, I would like to submit to you in tonight's presentation that if we were to answer this question, can we know for certain the future, you have to look at two main areas, two specific areas. Number one, you have to look for someone or something that has historical accuracy. That has what, everybody? Historical accuracy. By that I mean is that if you look at a document, you look at someone saying something, that it has to be factual. You see what I'm saying? That it has to be dependable. So it has to be historically accurate. It can't be saying one thing, but then it says another thing on the other side. You see what I mean? It has to be historically accurate. And the second thing I want to suggest to you tonight is that not only does it have to be historically accurate, it must have a proven track record. In other words, based on its dependable predictions. And so it has to be able to look back and say, well, it was consistent here, the document is consistent here, and so looking at the past, I can actually say, well, it is consistent throughout its claims, and it is being backed up by evidence. So we're going to look at those two criteria tonight of how we can know the future: historical accuracy and proven track record. And I'm going to base my whole talk tonight on these two main points, okay? And so, I want to ask the question tonight is there such a source? Is there a source that we have in our culture today that actually, number one, is historically accurate, and number two, has a proven track record? That's what I want to suggest and share with you this evening. And I'd like to suggest that absolutely there is. There is something that we can look at and say, you know what? This is not just fables and myths and stories. This is credible. It's a genuine document. It's been proven. And not only that, we can look at the past, that things that it has said, it has come to pass. And hopefully by the end of tonight's presentation, you can leave here with confidence that although we see all the chaos and all the hysteria around us, there is something this evening that we can put our trust in. And trust is a big word tonight, because we're living in a culture where trust is a very valued commodity. It's not something that comes very easily. So that's what we can look at this evening. So to answer those two questions, I want to look at basically two ideas this evening. I want to first look at university history. So some of what I'm going to say this evening is not what I'm saying. It's based on what learned scholars and people in their chosen fields have said about the topic, right? So we're going to look at history. Then we're also going to look at archaeology. Hands up if you like archaeology or you're interested in it. Some of us, we think archaeology, we think Egypt and the mummies and all the mummy movies we've grown up watching. You know, that's kind of how we see the idea of archaeology. So we're going to look at history, and we're going to look a little bit at archaeology tonight. So we're going to look at archaeology first, and what we'll notice in archaeology is that archaeologists have actually realized that there is a document today that it actually is credible and it is historically accurate. And so I want to begin my presentation by going to the Middle East, firstly going to Egypt. Hands up if you've been to Egypt. Anyone been to Egypt before? Wow, quite a few people here. Lovely place, isn't it? Yeah, I had the privilege of going to these places in September last year. Wonderful time, 5 weeks of my life. Just got married in September last year. 3 weeks later, I was on a plane with a bunch of strangers, and we were all touring all these wonderful countries, and it was an amazing, amazing experience. So we go to the magnificent land of the Nile in Egypt. And some of us, or some may have seen on the internet or documentary shows, some of these beautiful tourist destinations. The Colossi of Memnon in Luxor, and some the Abu Simbel temples there in Abu Simbel over there in Egypt. And so we also go to the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut in Deir el-Bahri. And so we look at all of these wonderful archaeological sites, and some of these sites are rather informative, but some of them are very credible because it points to something that is very meaningful and can give us trust in our world tonight. And obviously when we think about archaeology, one cannot pass the famous pyramids of Giza, and just a wonderful, wonderful place to visit, and it is truly beautiful. So I want to share with you three archaeological facts that basically point to the historical accuracy of a document I want to present to you in a few moments. But one of the most amazing archaeological discoveries was found by Napoleon Bonaparte back there in the early 1800s. And what Napoleon Bonaparte actually discovered was this article here, which is called the Rosetta Stone. Has anybody ever heard of the Rosetta Stone? Okay, quite a few of you. So basically what the Rosetta Stone was just a clay tablet basically. And I'm sorry, but you can't really see very closely, but inscribed on this stone are 3 languages. And basically they understood that it was 3 separate languages describing the same thing. And so the top layer, it was in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. And by the way, up until this point, nobody could understand what these ancient hieroglyphics meant, all their symbols. You know, all those symbols in the tombs and all this. No one could understand what it meant. So up until this point, up until they discovered the Rosetta Stone, there were Egyptian hieroglyphics on the top part, and on the middle part there was an unknown ancient Egyptian cursive script called Demotic. That's just what it was called. That was in the middle section. Then the bottom section was actually ancient Greek. So what scholars and those who are in this field, they began to work from the known to the unknown, right? So they couldn't understand what the hieroglyphics were saying, so the scholars would understand what ancient Greek was, so they moved from the ancient Greek, and then there they were able to interpret what the hieroglyphics meant. And so the man who is basically credited, some are disputing whether it's him or not, but generally speaking, whenever we talk about Rosetta Stone, this man's name comes up. And his name is Jean-Francois Champollion. Any Frenchmen here this evening? I hope I didn't abuse that name there. I was going through my notes the other night and I said Jean-Claude Van Damme. No, that's not him. It said Jean-Francois Champollion. And so he basically worked on the Rosetta Stone for 20 years. That's a lot of time. And he finally broke the code and he was able to decipher the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. And because of Jean-Francois' work, we are able to open the window of all the mass knowledge and the culture and all the aspects of the ancient Egyptians because of the work of the Rosetta Stone. So we have much to be thankful for to Jean-Francois Champollion. Also, another famous archaeological discovery is if you go to Iran, and what you find in Iran is this beautiful inscription here along the Silk Road. It's actually high up on the mountain wall, because back in those days, this was somewhat of a travelling highway, and this would be somewhat like a billboard poster where people put up their advertisements and somewhat. And so if you ever get to this part of the world in Iran, you'd see these magnificent inscriptions built there into the walls of the mountain. And so what one of these scripts along the Silk Road is the Behistun inscription, and this was actually made by Darius the Great between 522 BC and 486, and it was a depiction of Darius the Great. And so what had happened with this, it was written, sorry you can't actually see the writing there, but again, it had 3 sets of languages on this script, and one was Old Persian, the other one was Elamite, and the other one was Babylonian cuneiform scripts. And so what they discovered again is that they wanted to understand these ancient, by the way, cuneiform is the language that the ancient Mesopotamians spoke. So up until this point, they didn't understand these languages until again, a British soldier by the name of Henry Rawlinson began to decipher these ancient scripts, and what he began to decipher them. And what he found was that he was able to crack the code, and what that did for our culture is, again, in the same way that John opened up the hieroglyphics, it was able to open the vast knowledge of the Mesopotamian culture back there in the Middle East, in Iran, Iraq, what many scholars would suggest is the cradle of civilization. And so this discovery by Henry Rawlinson, he was able to interpret these inscriptions. And so now when you go to museums all over the world, these clay tablets, who just a number of years ago were basically unreadable, they were able to glean so much information from these cuneiform tablets. But that's the second one. But do you know what of all the archaeological discoveries, perhaps the most famous one we know is taken from Israel right by the Dead Sea. And you've probably seen it before on the news, you've probably seen it on documentaries. But back there they found perhaps would be the most exciting archaeological discovery of our century. And so we're taken there, the Qumran Desert by the Dead Sea, and an amazing discovery happened. By the way, I had to put this picture in, by the way. I'm standing right there in front of one of the caves where what I'm about to describe, they found these amazing artifacts. It was actually quite a hot day there. So I don't know if you can see the picture, but there's a little cave there. There's quite a number of them all over the Judean hills there. And so the story goes about this archaeological discovery is that back in 1947, there was a young Bedouin villager by the name of Muhammad Ed Dib. And so the story goes that he was taking care of his uncle's sheep, and so they went straying off into the mountains, so he went looking for them. And so when he went to one of these caves, he figured that one of the goats and the sheep went in there. So he picked up a rock and he launched it into the cave, thinking that it would scare the goat and the sheep would come out. But what actually happened when he threw the rock in the cave, that he heard this breaking noise, these pots. And so what did he do? He ran into the cave, and he was quite, disappointed, because all he found were these clay jar tablets. So he ran back, and he told his uncle, and he says, "Uncle, I saw all these things," and so they got all these clay jars, out of these caves. So the uncle took it down to the local marketplace, and he sold it to one of the tribesmen there for some money. And so he sold it to one guy for $100, which was quite cheap. You can see the next amount there. And so another person bought it off that guy for $500,000, $500,000. That's a lot of money, isn't it? US dollars. And obviously now, these documents, this discovery is priceless. And we know them today as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so, again, I had the privilege of going there to see this wonderful piece of literature. So I want to ask the question, why were they so valuable? What is it about these documents that was so important? Well, a couple of things. The first reason is that they are very, very old. You see, the older something is, the more value it has. And so what they discovered from these Dead Sea Scrolls by a number of things. Firstly, by the style of script. See, just by the very wording of the script, they could tell it came from a particular time period. It's a bit like English. The English we speak today is not the same English back in the 16th century. It's vastly different. So they could tell by the style of script what date period roughly came from. They could also tell by radiocarbon dating, roughly the time period. But also there were actually some gold coins found in these clay jars. And so scholars today, they roughly give the estimate that these Dead Sea Scrolls and what was found therein come from roughly 1 to 200 BC. That, friends, is over 2,100 years old that they found in these clay jars. Fascinating stuff. So number one, it was very old. But we go to number two, it also had ancient predictions with a proven track record. That's where we're going to launch into our second half of our meeting tonight, is that it had ancient predictions. Now, what are these scrolls? Well, basically in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they had basically it was divided into three parts. A third of the section was based on rules and regulations of the group that lived within that community. Scholars like to suggest that this group was known as the Essenes. Some of you may have heard this. Some even say that John the Baptist, what came in the Bible, came from the Essene community. He was out in the wilderness. They say that he may have belonged to this sect of Jews, very strict in their obedience to Jehovah. And so some of these documents contain the rules and regulations of this community. Some of the documents describe their beliefs. But in actual fact, and this may be surprising to some of you this evening, that over what they found in these documents was basically every book of the ancient Old Testament biblical manuscripts, except the book of Esther. Now, what I mean by that? The common Bible that we have in our culture today, when they compare our Bible today by what was discovered in the scrolls of the Dead Sea, it was basically the same. I'm going to unpack that in just a moment. And so these documents had the ancient Old Testament Hebrew biblical manuscripts. And what they found that is so amazing about these Dead Sea Scrolls is that they found that the biblical manuscripts haven't changed through time. Now let me just kind of pause and just explain something. There is a common argument against the biblical documents that we cannot trust it because it's a copy of a copy of a copy. Some of you have heard this before. Some of you may have that reasoning tonight. That's totally fine. But the idea goes like this. If we don't have the original copies, William, of the original documents of the Scripture, if we just have copies that have been handed down over centuries, copy to copy to copy to copy to copy, from the times of the apostles right down to our time, then surely we can't have the original meaning. Do you see the argument? It's kind of like playing Chinese whispers. If I whisper something to my sister here on the front row here, and it travels all the way to the back of the hall, and it comes all the way back here, my brother Brent, will maybe be different from what started. Do you see my point? And so the argument is, we can't trust this biblical document because it is not authoritative, and it's not something we can depend on. And I've heard this before. In fact, I had this reasoning before. And so what they found is that the biblical manuscripts, the copies that are found in the Dead Sea, you've got to understand this. This is going back 2,100 years. And the same copies that are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls would be virtually the same as the average Bible you would have in your home or in your hotel room. The Gideon's Bible that somehow placed in every hotel. Now, what does that mean? It means that, and this is when I saw this for myself, it was totally amazing. In fact, they almost had the whole of the book of Isaiah. In our day and age, we have a Bible that's kind of like that thick. Then they were scrolls. So the book of Isaiah, the scroll went over 8 meters. And they were so particular, these Essenes community people, that they would copy it by hand. And some of the things the tour guide was explaining to us was quite remarkable. They would actually copy everything, letter by letter. They would do a letter count at every chapter, word count. And if they messed up in one point, they had to throw the thing out and start again. Can you imagine if you're working on a 9-meter scroll of Isaiah and you're just copying it faithfully all the way? You get to the last sentence and you just muck up the A with a Z. But what? You got to start again. It would be terrible. This is how much they honoured and they kept faithful the scripture that was given to them. And so when they compared the biblical manuscripts of many of what we have today with what they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was basically the same thing. Now there were a few quite minor adjustments, like there was a comma missing there, or the letter was an E instead of A. But by and large, the majority of the message and the meaning was still preserved. And I think that's a wonderful thing. So, essentials for knowing the future. It's historical accuracy. And number 2, there's also, we look at a proven track record, dependable predictions. So, we looked at somewhat, very briefly, the historical accuracy based on archaeology. I want to look now at one of the archaeology's most, esteemed archaeologists. His name is W.F. Albright. I know for most of you that name is just a name, but in the archaeological community, he's very well respected. He's one of the greatest archaeologists of our time, and he's the author of over 800 works on archaeology, and he also was the director of the American School of Oriental Research. Now, this is not just any research. This is like the top of the top. It's like the Oxford of archaeologists go and study at this place. W.F. Albright was one of the leading archaeologists in this research facility. And I want you to notice, pay attention to what he said about the biblical record. Now this is what he's saying, it's not what I'm saying. This is straight from someone who's dealt with this area for a number of years. He says, in the center of history stands the Bible. Thanks to modern research, we can now recognize its substantial historicity. In other words, its historical accuracy. Then he goes on to say, to sum up, we can now treat the Bible from beginning to end as an authentic document of religious history. Now that's W.F. Albright. You know, if you're sitting here this evening and you're a bit of a skeptic about perhaps anything that's somewhat religious, or even the idea of the biblical manuscript as a credible piece of historical material, I just want to challenge you to have an open mind and to listen to what some who have been in this sphere and have been studying have to say about it. That's all I'm suggesting to you tonight. That according to W.F. Albright, it is an authentic document of religious history. Now to the evidence. And we go to archaeology again. And we go now to the ancient city of Babylon, which is now modern-day Iraq. And so we go to the ancient Babylonian Empire. And there's a fascinating story I want to share with you in just a few moments. In the old ancient kingdom of Babylon, there was a king that ruled by the name of Nebuchadnezzar II. And the king of Babylon ruled, Nebuchadnezzar ruled Babylon, and he destroyed Jerusalem back in 586 BC. So 500 years before the birth of Christ, some 2,500 years ago, there was the Babylonian Empire. They ruled the world. The king was Nebuchadnezzar. And so he destroyed Jerusalem. This is a historical fact. It's also written in the biblical record. And so part of this story, and by the way, you've got to follow my story because it's leading to something very important, okay? So part of the story is when King Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, he actually took quite a few people as captives back to Babylon. And so in the biblical account, one of these captives is a man by the name of Daniel. Now, Daniel also is the author of a book in the Old Testament called, you guessed it, the Book of Daniel. And so Daniel has a historical focus on the happenings around his time. In fact, scholars suggest that the Book of Daniel was written roughly around 530 BC. Now, what is so intriguing about the Book of Daniel? Well, let's just see. So, what happened in the Book of Daniel? So, by the way, if you don't have time, if you go home and if you've got a Bible, if you look it up on Google, you just type in Daniel chapter 1 and Daniel chapter 2. This is all there, okay? So, what do we find here in the book of Daniel? Well, in Daniel chapter 2, we're introduced to this king, Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Now, that's nothing unusual. He has a dream one night. And so, the biblical document says that King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And in this dream, there were a few things that were mentioned in it. That there will be 4 successive empires to rule the world. And what we'll find is they did. Europe today was mentioned in this dream. And we'll also notice that when Nebuchadnezzar had the dream, he woke up and he was quite upset. Now, why was he upset? Well, in the Babylonian Empire, part of the Middle Eastern culture was dreams were somewhat of an omen. You know what I mean? A dream was somewhat a revealing of the future. And we know this from archaeology because they found dream omen tablets in these areas. And so the idea was when a king, or anyone for that matter, had a dream, it was somewhat of a revealing from the gods, so to speak, of something that was meant to happen. So the story goes in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 1 and 2, that King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, but like many of us, he had the dream, and guess what? Some of you know the next step? He forgot the dream. Has that ever happened to you? Happened all the time. You know what? I have to confess, when I was a young kid, I used to have dreams about, I won't tell you what I had dreams about, but sometimes when I woke up and I realised that I was still awake, I try to go back to sleep again. Have you ever done that? Because you wanted to be back in the dream, not in reality? Okay, I'll leave that with you. King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream one night. So he woke up and didn't know what the dream was about. So what did he do? Well, he called his advisors. That's what you do. He had all these prominent people that were supposedly able to reveal the future. And so some of them were astrologers, and the biblical account says they were magicians. Or in what we would call in today's culture, they were psychics. And so he had all of these magicians and astrologers that were there to interpret his dream for him. And so Nebuchadnezzar woke up, he didn't understand the dream. So what did he do? He went to his men and he said, I dreamed a dream. And so what do you think they would have said to him?
That's nice. Tell us what it is.
Oh man, we've got a very intelligent crowd tonight. They said, you tell us the dream, and then we'll tell you what it meant. Now what's the problem in that?
They can tell them anything they like.
Exactly. You can tell them anything you want. If you told me you had a dream that you were dancing with a yellow koala up in the... I could just make up anything. But the king wasn't no standover. He knew exactly what these guys were about. And so he got very irate. And you read this in the biblical account. He said, if you don't tell me this dream, and not only what I dreamt, you interpret it, something nasty is going to happen to you. And so we also know back in archaeology, some of you cannot see, but if you look very closely, excavations in Babylon or in modern day Iraq uncovered these astrology charts. So the ancient Babylonians were very into trying to understand and know the future. And so we go back to the story in Daniel that when these astrologers and magicians told the king they couldn't understand, they couldn't tell him the dream. In fact, if you read the biblical account, they say there's no one that can interpret this dream but God. He got furious, and what he did next was rather astonishing. He pronounced the death decree on all the wise men of Babylon. And you have to understand, when you read it, first off, you have this impression that he's just being a very nasty man. But in fact, think about it. These men, he paid. He gave them rather lucrative positions in the Babylonian Empire to interpret all these things. And so when it came to the crunch and he needed to know, they couldn't answer him. So what does this king do? He wanted to execute all the wise men of Babylon. Now the story goes that, remember we talked about Daniel just a few moments ago? Daniel is actually one of these, I guess, up-and-coming trainers to be in his wise counselor, group. So Daniel finds himself in a bit of a predicament. He's now numbered with the wise men. And now his life is on the line. Now I don't know about you, but if I knew that I had 24 hours to live, the biblical record doesn't say how long they were given, but basically their life was on the line. The Bible says that Daniel, when he found out, he did what some of us would do, is that he went and he prayed. Now can I just pause here? What I'm saying is a little bit controversial, because we live in a culture where anything goes these days. But when you look at the biblical record, Daniel had a relationship to what he believed was a higher power called Jehovah God. And Daniel prayed to his God. Have you ever heard the famous saying, there are no atheists in foxholes? Some of you have heard that saying. Daniel, when his life was on the line, he prayed. And he basically asked God to reveal this vision to him. And he basically, when you read the biblical account, he gets his friends with him, and they pray that God would reveal what the king had dreamt. That's a pretty incredible prayer. To ask God to reveal to you a dream that someone else had dreamt, and not only that, interpret that to them. That's what Daniel prayed. And the Bible says that God actually answered his prayer. And so while Daniel was sleeping, God revealed to Daniel, Jehovah God, revealed to Daniel the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had dreamt that night. And so when Daniel went to sleep, God revealed to him the vision that the king had seen. So the next night, or the next day, so to speak, young Daniel, by the way, scholars suggest that when Daniel was standing in the court of the king of Babylon, he was roughly about 18 or 19 years old. So he was still a young fella. And he's standing there. Now, this is an artist's illustration. This is not, So Daniel's there, and he stands in front of the most powerful man in the then-known world. He says, King Nebuchadnezzar, haven't your wise men and astrologers been able to interpret the dream? but there is a God in heaven who's able to interpret. Now I've got this video I'd like to share with you. So Daniel basically says, King Nebuchadnezzar, you basically saw in your dream a vision, a statue of 4 articles of metal. One, the head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze. Then you saw the legs were of iron, and then you saw that the feet were actually part iron and part clay. Next you saw King Nebuchadnezzar with a stone cut out without hands, smashed the image on its feet. The image basically disintegrated to smithereens, and then this rock eventually filled the whole earth. Now, can we just pause and put our imagination caps on? What do you think Nebuchadnezzar would have been thinking when he saw all this? He would have been like, that's it? That's it? That's exactly what I dreamt. And young Daniel stands before King Nebuchadnezzar, not only tells him what he dreamt, but then he now begins to interpret what this dream actually meant. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. Basically, this vision that Nebuchadnezzar was given was basically an outline of world history starting from Nebuchadnezzar's day back in 586 BC all the way through to our time. And let me just share with you that with you in just a moment. So, succession of 4 world empires, culminating in the very last empire, the Rock Kingdom, that would destroy the statue image, the last empire. So let's go back to the vision. Let's try to break it down piece by piece. Daniel says to King Nebuchadnezzar, let's just go back to that image. See the 4 middle image, head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, iron and clay. Daniel says to King Nebuchadnezzar, you are this head of gold. That's what the biblical account says in chapter 2, verse 38. You, Nebuchadnezzar, you represent the gold part of the image. That's you, Nebuchadnezzar. Can you imagine Nebuchadnezzar? He was probably like sitting there on his throne going, yeah, that sounds good. I'm the head of gold. And that's me. I'm the man. That's what he probably would have been thinking. But then the story doesn't last long for Nebuchadnezzar. But the Bible says, you are this head of gold. And it's interesting why the biblical record says that Nebuchadnezzar, the kingdom of Babylon, would be referenced to the metal of gold. So if some of you may know this, but from history we understand that Babylon ruled the world from 605 to 539 BC. 605 to 539 BC. And is represented by the kingdom of Babylon. Babylon was actually a golden empire. In fact, did you know that Cyrus actually took many treasures from Babylon? Did you also know that Artaxerxes took over $150 million worth of treasure from Babylon? All gold. All gold. In fact, Alexander the Great, some of you know this, Alexander the Great, it is told, he took 500 camels loaded with gold back to Greece. So much gold that was there in the city of Babylon. Now, when we look at the artist's depiction of Babylon, it wasn't a big city in today's standards, but back in those days, it was a big city. In fact, Babylon was somewhat 16 kilometers around circumference. When you compare that with Rome and with Athens, Rome is 9.6 kilometers, Athens is 6.4. But so in today's standards, it wasn't a huge city, very small actually, but in those days, it was the biggest city in the then known world. In fact, when you were living in the days of Babylon, if you went into the front entrance of the city of Babylon, you had to walk through the Ishtar gates. Now, this is a replica. This is not the original. If you wanted to see the original, you would have to go to the Pergamon Museum over in Berlin. And what they did was excavators that were sponsored from Germany, they went all the way to Iraq, and they went and dug up brick by brick the Ishtar gates, and they transported it all the way back to Germany. And so now you would see the literal gate. This would have been the gate. If you were living in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, this was the literal gate that you'd have to walk through. Isn't it amazing? Stepping back through time. You'll also notice that as you walk through in the museum, they also have these processional ways. You can't see the picture very clearly, but these are actually blue glazed tiles featuring winged lions. It was a fantastic, a spectacular city, the city of Babylon. In fact, in the biblical record, you notice in Daniel chapter 4 that Nebuchadnezzar was the founder of Babylon. And you can read that in the biblical account. And so, one of the arguments against the biblical record is they said, you know what? Nebuchadnezzar wasn't the founder of Babylon. Some archaeologists were saying it was actually Semiramis was actually the originator of Babylon. You can read about it. And so there was all these to and fro. You can't trust the Bible because Daniel chapter 4, it's not Nebuchadnezzar, it's Semiramis, right? Until when they looked at the Ishtar gates, they noticed some of these inscriptions along the pillar walls. And what they found when they looked closer is that it actually had this inscripted on the side of these Ishtar gates. I, Nebuchadnezzar, laid the foundation of the gates. Very clearly. It said, I, Nebuchadnezzar, laid the foundation of the gates. And in fact, if you look at the hundreds of bricks that were kind of taken back to Berlin that sits in the Pergamon Museum, there were bricks with inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar's name on it. And so again, the Bible has proved that it is a historically true document. It's not something that's just like a kid's bedtime story. It is actually a factual document. So what actually happened in Babylon? Because remember the image said he's the head of gold. Well, what happened next is that Daniel says in the interpretation, he says, but after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours. That's found in the book of Daniel there. And so what happened to the kingdom of Babylon? Well, some of you may know that like history, that Babylon was actually defeated by the Medo-Persian kingdom. The Medes were a coalition of two kingdoms, the Medes and the Persians, symbolized of the two arms. It was a joint coalition. The Mede and Persian kingdom actually destroyed Babylon in 539 BC. And so that's why the vision given by head of gold Babylon, the next empire would be the kingdom of Medo and Persia. And they ruled from 539 to 331 BC. So how did Babylon fall, so to speak? Well, you find this in the biblical record in chapter 5 of the book of Daniel. Basically, Belshazzar, Babylon's last king, is actually having a feast. He's having a party, basically. And right there in the middle of the party, there's handwriting on the wall. You may have seen this famous painting by Rembrandt depicting the story in the biblical record, the writing on the wall. And that's where we get that famous terminology. The writings on the wall comes right from the book of Daniel. And so in the story, there was something written on the wall. Everyone in there couldn't understand what it meant. And so who can understand what it's saying? They called Daniel. He came out. Basically, it's saying, the party's over. It was finished. That's the modern day translation. Basically saying, it's over. Babylon fell that very night. So what actually happened? When you look at the Nabonidus cylinder, you'll notice that it actually talks about the overthrow of Babylon by Cyrus. And it also says there that Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus, the king of Babylon. We also find in Nabonidus' chronicle, it also depicts how easily that the kingdom of Babylon was destroyed by the Medes and the Persian. But it also says something very interesting, that Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to Belshazzar in the 3rd year of his reign. The reason why I bring this up tonight, friends, is because up until this discovery, many were saying, you don't see the name Belshazzar anywhere else in history. So this Belshazzar character that's described in Daniel, we don't see any record of him. So he's not true, he's fictional. Until they found this chronicle, and it actually says that Nabonidus, which was Belshazzar's father, was the king of Babylon. He actually entrusted the kingship to his son Belshazzar, and that's where we find the story of Daniel chapter 5. We've got to keep moving. And so we get to archaeology once again. What happened to Babylon? Well, in October 13, 539, Babylon fell. And the story goes that while Belshazzar and his entourage were having a feast to their, and if you read the story very carefully, they're actually praising the gods of wood, and stoned. They were basically mocking Jehovah of Israel, and judgment came on that kingdom that very evening. So the story goes that the Medes and the Persians, they actually diverted the river Euphrates. Some of you know this story, because the city of Babylon, actually, the river Euphrates actually ran right through the city of Babylon. And so basically the place was impregnable. See, they had these large walls around here. This is just an artist's depiction. They had these gates, and they also had this front gate here. So how was it captured? Well, basically what happened, and Herodotus and philosophers can also attest to this, is that what happened was that the Medo-Persian army of Cyrus, they besieged Babylon, and while they were having their night of fun and revelry, something happened. The soldiers actually diverted the Euphrates River, and basically they diverted the river to an open bank bed so that all the river would be diverted to one place. The river actually went down, and what happened? The soldiers just walked straight through, and they marched right into Babylon. And what was so fascinating about this is that it was actually predicted in the biblical manuscript. In fact, 150 years before the Bible predicted Cyrus would take Babylon and restore Jerusalem's temple. Now, this, I have to say, this is fascinating. 150 years before Cyrus was even born, the biblical account predicted not only that Babylon would be how it would fall, but the name of the very person who would do it, Cyrus. And if you read the account there, it says in the book of Isaiah, it says, "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him and loose the armor of kings, to open before him the double doors so that the gates will not be shut." Do you know what's so important about that prediction? Is because when the gates were always shut all the time, but when the city was having a big party, even the soldiers that were stationed at the gates, they were drinking, having a good time, and they left the gates open, and what happened? The whole of the Medo-Persian army walked right through, exactly as the Bible had predicted. It's a fascinating document. Even the ancient Jewish historian Josephus talks about how Babylon fell by the Medo-Persian army. And in fact, we even see there in the book of Isaiah that it was even predicted that the Jews would actually be able to rebuild their temple once again. In fact, you go back to the biblical record, it says, "Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple your foundation shall be laid." Because you remember what happened. When Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem, he destroyed the temple. He destroyed everything, took all the vessels and all the articles, took it back. The Bible predicted that not only that Cyrus would come on the scene, destroy the Babylonian Empire, but they would come back to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. It's a very important point. I've got to keep going. The Cyrus cylinder also mentions about how easy that the Medes and Persians took over Babylon. I've got to keep moving. So now we kind of touched on a little bit about the prophetic reliability. We keep moving on in the vision. So we've talked about Babylon, we've talked about Medo-Persia. Then the prophecy goes on to say, this is Daniel speaking, he says, "Then a third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth." Can anybody guess who was the next kingdom after the Medes and the Persians? So, right, all close? Yes, exactly. It was actually the kingdom of Greece. Greece actually defeated the Medo-Persians back in 331 BC. Now, I've just got to keep moving on because, just for time's sake, okay? So we find that Alexander the Great, he defeated the Medo-Persians army in the Battle of Arbela in 331 AD. And so, again, when you look at Alexander the Great, it was told when the Medes and Persians came to Athens, they destroyed the city. And so some suggest that's why when King Alexander came on the throne, he went to Iran and he destroyed the city of Persepolis, almost as a revenge for what the Medes and the Persians had done to his city back in Athens. So that's some of the story that goes behind the scenes there. And so let's kind of bring this almost to a close. We've got Head of gold represented by Babylon, silver and chest represented by Medo-Persia, the bronze belly represented by Greece, and then we come to the last kingdom, my brother. The next kingdom on the scene, we're told in the biblical record, finally there'll be a fourth kingdom, strong as what? Iron. Now, who represented the legs of iron? Well, it's right there on the screen. It is represented by Rome, exactly. Rome defeated Greece. I hope you're sitting here tonight going, wow, the Bible actually predicted these 4 world empires. Amazing. Rome defeated Greece. Edward Gibbons, that famous historian, said that all of these preceding kingdoms were finally defeated by the iron monarchy of Rome. He even describes it. He's using prophetic language in his historical document. Now, we all know about the city of Rome. It was the Iron Empire, a formidable fighting machine. So, follow with me tonight, friends. We're going through a sweep of history. Head of gold, Babylon. Silver and chest, Medo-Persia. Bronze belly, Greece. Then we get to iron legs, each represented by the kingdom of Rome, from 168 through to 476 AD. Fascinating. Now, what happened next in the story? Well, the Bible actually says that whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, there's a symbol, there's a meaning there. What does it mean? Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar, the kingdom shall be divided. It shall be what? Divided. It shall be divided. So the kingdom shall be partly strong and it shall be partly fragile or weak. That's the symbol between the toes. Part iron, part clay. Part strong, part weak. That's the interpretation there. And did you know that that's exactly what happened to Rome? Rome didn't fall in a day. It wasn't overtaken by another world empire. What happened to Rome? It basically disintegrated. The Germanic tribes actually came and overtook it. And so it slowly but surely disintegrated into what we would now call Western Europe. Isn't it fascinating? The prophecy actually predicted that after Rome, not another world power, it actually disintegrated into the Western Rome in what we would call today modern Europe. So I'm not sure if you can see the screen from back where you're sitting, but some of these tribes, the Alami, the Anglo-Saxons, I think the easiest one, that's where we'd get the English. Then we get the Lombards, the Italians, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths. These were the names back then. Now, it's what we would now call Western Europe. Fascinating. Now again, let's just recap. Head of gold, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, then Western Europe. And believe me, this is all meaning something. Because at the end, I'm going to tell you exactly where we are in terms of history and time. We go back to the prophecy there. Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, as you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, notice how precise this prediction is. They will mingle with the seed of men. Now what does that mean? I'll explain it in a moment. But they will not adhere one to another, just as what? Iron does not mix with clay. What's it talking about? What the prophecy is saying is that they will try to be one, but it will never happen. Right? In fact, you'll never be united into one empire. In fact, friends, over the course of history, do you know that mankind has tried to subvert and prove the prediction of the book of Daniel wrong? Many have attempted to unite Europe. Charlemagne has attempted to unite Europe. He failed. Louis the 14th also failed. And this character that some of us know really well, Napoleon, actually failed. And so what happened when he tried to bring Europe together, notice what he said. He said, there'll be one Europe. Listen to the language. There'll be one Europe. There'll be one currency. Do we hear that today? Yes. There will be one language. There will be one government over all of Europe. This was Napoleon's dream, and he wanted to be the head of it. And you know what? At the famous Battle of Waterloo, when he failed and he was defeated, it was quoted that he said these words. I think it's quite interesting. He said, God Almighty is too much for me. You know what I hazard to believe? Napoleon understood the prophecy in Daniel chapter 2. And even he, when he was defeated, said, you know what? He's too much for me. It's too much. Can't do it. We go to Kaiser Wilhelm in the Second World War. He desired to make Western Europe one great superstate. He also failed. I've got to keep going along. We go to Metz Cathedral in France. And if you go to this wonderful cathedral here, you'll notice something inside the building. In fact, Kaiser Wilhelm, when he was asked to donate money to build this magnificent building, the people who were basically building the building said, "We need money, King." And he said, "I will build it only on one condition." He said, "You see that statue at the front of the cathedral? Some of you may know this, but do you know who this person is depicted to be? It's depicted to be Daniel, the prophet from the book of Daniel. The king said, I want you to take his head off and put my head on it." This is a true story. He said, if you leave Daniel's head on this statue, I'm not going to give the money. And so that's what the story goes. Because Kaiser knew that there was a prediction in the prophecy that said that there will never be a united Europe. And last of all, we know this character. We don't need to elaborate on him. But you know about Hitler. What did he want? He wanted a one world religion. He wanted to be the head. He wanted to be the ruler of Europe. And we all know that he failed in his attempt. In fact, Hitler is quoted as saying, one people, one empire, one leader. You know what I find fascinating, friends, if you haven't got it by now? Is that mankind has tried to bring Europe together, but the prediction actually said they will mingle themselves, but they will not adhere one to another. I find that fascinating. Because the scripture says they will not adhere or stick one to another. I've got to wrap this up because time's getting away from it. When it says they will mingle themselves with the seed of men, you'll also notice that Europe tried to form alliances between nations through marriage. And it's something that still happens today. And so, what does the prophecy say? I'm just going to read the first part, forgive me. It says they will mix with one another in marriage. And so what you'll notice is if you go to a place such as the Frederiksborg Castle in Denmark, and you happen to go inside, you will see pictures all over the castle of all these marriage alliances that happened between the kingdoms. Like the daughter of France would marry the son of the king of Germany, and Germany would marry Switzerland, and Switzerland would marry, all this intermarrying. Why? Because they were doing it for political reasons. They wanted to forward their nation's interests. But the prophecy stands still true. They will mingle themselves with the seed of men, but it would not cleave one to another. United States of Europe. That has been the goal down through time. I'm going to wrap this up. President Mitterrand of France, quoted as saying, "A great power is being born." Helmut Kohl, Chancellor of Germany, said, "The course is irreversible," talking about this one world Europe. And then lastly, this man said, "We can and will succeed in creating a unified, prosperous, democratic Europe where citizens can live in peace and freedom." That's Romano Prodi. They're all saying the same thing. There's going to be one Europe. It's going to be one, just like it was. But you know what? The prediction said it will not happen. Some of you know this has been on the news quite recently. Brexit. We've all heard of that. England pulled out of the European. Isn't it amazing that the more that history has been trying to bring it together, now it's going the other way. It's going the opposite. They'll be never to be united into one empire. And as I close, we go to the last aspect of the prediction. After Daniel outlines the four metal images and the toes, he says, "You watched while the stone was cut out without hands," talking about it's a supernatural experience, not something that's man-made, "which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces." The stone that would come and smash the image at its feet. What stone does that stone represent? And I want to end on these thoughts because it's wonderful. The scripture says And in the days of these kings, can I just pause? What's the days of these kings? What's that referencing? Which part of the image?
Our days.
Exactly, our days, the toes. In the days of these kings, the divided empire, or what we call, in the days of Western Europe, if I could bring it a bit closer to home, in our day, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So, I asked you a question at the start of the evening. How can we know the future? This prophecy predicts over 2,000 years of human history. And what I want to submit to you tonight is that we look at the scope of time we are living. If we're going to trust the biblical account as an authentic document, that we're living right on the toenails of time, if I could put it that way. The last empire is about to appear. And we're told about this dream. Daniel says, the great God has shown the king what shall come to pass in the future. And the dream is certain, and the interpretation is sure. So we go back. Now, I'm just going to pause and say something. If this is true, Babylon was predicted, it came and went. If Medo-Persia was predicted, it came and went. If Greece was predicted, it came and went. If Rome was predicted, it came and went. If the iron and part clay is predicted and it's happening now, could it be that the next event in this prophetic prediction, the stone kingdom, could that be a reality? I'm going to leave that with you tonight. We're living on the window of the last empire. And I just want to end with some encouraging thoughts. Now, you don't have to be religious or not to appreciate these next few things I want to share with you. Because if you really think about it, it's a place that you want to be part of. And I want to share a couple of things with you. In the last book of the scriptures, in the book of what we call Revelation, it describes this stone kingdom. I want to read it to you tonight. It says, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ. He shall reign forever and ever. And I love this part. It says, God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things are passed away. Then he who sat on the throne said, behold, I make all things new. Friends, this is a description of the stone kingdom. It's going to be drastically different from the experience that we have today. I don't know about you, but I'm sick and tired of going to funerals. I'm sick and tired of seeing my friends and family and relatives experience pain on so many areas, so many levels, physical, spiritual, emotional. But you know, if we follow the biblical account, the stone kingdom represents a kingdom that God said when he establishes, it's not going to be overtaken by another power. It's not going to be overtaken by another metal image. It's going to stand forever. No tears, no pain, no sorrow, no death. The dream is certain, the interpretation is short. I asked you at the start of the evening, we shared this story. The submarine has asked this question, is there any hope? I use that as an entryway into our talk tonight. I want to suggest to you tonight that there is hope. There is hope. We look at the predictions. They can only give us such a percentage of their accuracy. If anything, I want to appeal to you tonight in our opening meetings to come each night with an open mind, an open heart. I understand that we live in a culture where everyone has their ideas and their views. We live in a very a diverse community where everyone has their particular ideas. I just want to submit to you that if you would just come to our meetings, we would just like to present to you from a historical, biblical perspective of what the future can hold. And tonight we've only looked at one prediction that we found in the book of Daniel. You know, sometimes when we talk about the end of the world and you see movies, it's always this gloom and doom stuff. You know, get ready, the end of the world! Ah! You know, like everyone's just panicking and everything. I want to suggest to you that when you read the biblical account, it's not about scaring people. It's about giving people hope. And so as you come night after night, we're going to deal with predictions concerning our time. And what I'm hoping that it will leave you with tonight, and I'm not sure what brought you here or why you're sitting here, But I want to submit to you that at the end of our meetings over the next few weeks, that you would walk away with a sense of hope and meaning out of this crazy world we live in. That there is something, if I could be driving closer to home, there's someone that's behind all this. We'll also close on this, Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you hope in the future. The reason I share this tonight is because if you've never read the biblical account, a lot of your picture could be based on, I don't know, come from a number of areas, your upbringing, a family member. But I just want to declare to you straight from the biblical record, when you look at the Bible describes a God that wants to give you hope and a future. And that's why I love presenting these topics, because I found meaning in these meetings. In fact, I came to a meeting like this some 10 years ago, and it's changed my life drastically. And probably in the next few weeks I can share a bit about that. But I leave that with you tonight. Over 800 prophetic verses, 90% is already filled, 10% to be fulfilled soon. Over the next few weeks, we'll understand the meaning of the current world events. We'll know what the future holds. We'll discover how to face the future with absolute hope and confidence. And we'll find increased meaning and purpose in life. And so I just want to close our meeting tonight by just saying thank you for coming. We went a little bit over time, but I trust that it's something for you to think about. If you want to come tomorrow night, we start at 6 o'clock in the evening. And we're actually going to do 2 back-to-back programs. We're going to do 6 to about 6:45, have a 15-minute break, and we'll go from 7 through to 8, and then we'll close it there. So thank you for coming, and I'll look forward to shaking you out on the way out, and love to see you tomorrow evening. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Come on a journey to lost civilizations. See ancient artifacts and long-lost ancient scrolls.
The strange writing on this clay brick is known as cuneiform. Now, the script was used for
Take the journey of a lifetime and travel to ancient Babylon and the island of Patmos to discover how ancient mysteries reveal the future. A live seminar series. Don't miss any program.